Thank you very much. Okay, so as you might notice, it's really a completely different topic than what was announced. So I won't talk about autism at all, and I won't talk about metaphor almost at all. But if you are interested in autism and metaphor, I'm very happy to discuss with you. I have a whole other talk on metaphor and autism, and I'm very happy to discuss the data and the consequences if you're interested. It's just that Diana Mazzarella and I have this proposition about irony and how it relates to epistemic vigilance. And after Yolanda's thesis, it seemed that that was maybe a topic that was very much on the interest of the day, irony. And I thought it might be interesting to have your input also on that new proposition we put forward. So this is entirely, all of what I'm going to talk about now is entirely work with Diana. That talk, because I had to take more or less something I already have, focuses kind of the entry point is children, but it's really just the entry point. So what we really want to talk about is not just about kids at all. It's really about irony and how irony is understood. We came to it via the developmental data. That's how we started thinking about it. But now very clearly it's about irony. The other kind of, before I begin, is this is very much built on a view of irony that's attributive. So suspend judgment for a while, and of course we can get back to that. But please roll with it for a bit, and so you can see the argument, and then we can discuss it more generally. Okay. So, as I said, we started, initially, in fact, when we started working together, Diana and I weren't working on irony at all. Now we very much are, but I had been working for a while on pragmatic development, and, well, pragmatic plays really a grounding role in the development of children's communicative skills, in the development of their linguistic skills. Even I think Mikhail would agree with that. And generally, even language seems to, at least in neurotypical children, to require impressive inferential abilities. But on the opposite side of this, we have what I call here Gricean pragmatic inferences, so things like metaphors, implicatures, irony, that develop later than other linguistic skills. Now, when we look at more recent studies, including some of the studies I've done, they suggest that preschoolers have more advanced pragmatic skills, at least more advanced of these linguistic pragmatic skills, in particular metaphor understanding and implicature understanding, but also things like presuppositions, metonymy. And that by preschoolers we mean, well, it depends on the paradigms and it depends on the phenomenon, but we start around the age of 3 and more 4 for implicatures, although some implicatures are also understood at around the age of 3 in some paradigms. And implicatures, bearing in mind, of course, that you can't really go much below 3 because the linguistic abilities, like the vocabulary, is not enough. So we've done some paradigms with 2.5-year-olds, and you very quickly you're stuck because your population is not even in terms of vocabulary. So, okay, all of these are great, and then we have this striking exception, which is irony. Yeah, so what's interesting with irony is that whatever we've done with me and a lot of other people have done with other pragmatic abilities, getting rid of metalinguistic tasks, making the tasks easier, using the type of actors, all of that fails. So no matter the paradigm you look at, irony is not understood at 3. There's absolutely no data that shows that. You have some elements that suggest some understanding at the age of 4, but absolutely nothing before, and mostly nothing before the age of 6, experimentally at least. It's really so. As I mentioned before, and Michael repeated it, I've never much believed in thresholds, but there we seem to have something that's immune to the paradigms. I remember a researcher coming to the Max Planck to work with Tomasello, and she worked with irony, and she was banging her head against the walls because it really didn't work, no matter what she did. And there's a lot of other people who have experienced that. So what I'll talk about today is mention the fact that irony comes late, mention the ironical attitude, which is, I think, crucial. So far so good. I think we all agree on the ironical attitude, but the way I'll account for it, of course, is different. And then talk about irony and epistemic vigilance. And the point really of this paper is not really the first order epistemic vigilance and its role, but what Diana and I have suggested, which is the role of second order epistemic vigilance. We'll get to what this is. Okay, so irony comes late. So as I mentioned, you have metaphor, hyperbole, metonymy. Around the age of 3, you already find them in some paradigms. I've been a big promoter of this idea, and for irony, really not before the age of 6. Often when you talk to parents, actually, they concur. I mean, they will say that they know when the kids start being ironical. The kids can be also quite explicit about it. They joke about it. They say, we're being sarcastic now. This is something they don't really do with metaphor or metonymy, or even really with implicatures that they start using also much earlier. So they struggle with irony until the age of 6, and when we say at least until the age of 6, it's really at least. So the age of 6 is really the earliest you find it in experimental paradigm. So there's one study which is a production study where you can see that it's a bit earlier, but only in families where sarcasm is used regularly. That's much later than other phenomena. It's insensitive to task, so we see task manipulation. There seems to be a threshold, and often this discrepancy between irony and other pragmatic phenomena in development is attributed to sophisticated mind-reading abilities. So what Yolanda's thesis was criticizing in big time, the idea of the involvement of a theory of mind, right? Now, what's interesting is that in addition to all of this, the development of irony comprehension displays specific patterns that in fact we need to explain. And these patterns are unique to irony. So irony comprehension tends to correlate with success in second order false belief tasks, which is not the case for other pragmatic phenomena. In fact, it wouldn't match because these pragmatic phenomena are generally understood around the age of, I would say, the age of 3, but even if you push it the age of 4, etc., and certainly not 5, 6 when you pass a second order false belief type. And irony also seems to correlate with the understanding of lies. So now remember what Michael was saying earlier about the idea that maybe perspective taking plays a role in recognition of deception and irony, and maybe not in other phenomena. Well, I'm going to try to convince you that maybe it's not just perspective taking that plays a role, but it's the same element. The other thing that's really interesting is that young children display a pattern. So they seem to interpret irony first as errors or mistakes. That is to say, they first will think that the speaker is just mistaken, even though they have evidence in a paradigm that the speaker actually knows what they're talking about, and they have seen the same evidence as the child has. They will think, oh, well, he's just mistaken. He just made a mistake. And then, a bit later, they will start interpreting irony as lies or deception. So then they will say, well, clearly the speaker knows what they're talking about. I know that because we've had the same evidence, or it's part of the story, or whatever, but he's just lying. Okay? And only later do they start recognizing the ironical intent of the speaker. So the idea is that maybe there's something there that we should be able to explain. So the question, of course, is what makes irony different from other figurative uses? And this was the kind of child introduction to get in, but really from now on it's truly not just about children. I think what we propose also helps to explain what the data on neuroatypical populations and the fact that some neuroatypical populations have issues with irony, and also, in fact, some data in neurotypical adults with difficulties with irony being slower, or very specific patterns that we see, some of which Mikhail mentioned. So, okay, so the first issue is the ironical attitude. So irony is traditionally seen as involving opposition, a reversal of meaning. So Kepa says to Joanna, the talk was really excellent after I've been boring you for quite an hour, but that doesn't seem to be really the main purpose of irony, just the reversal. The main purpose of irony seems to have to do something with this attitude. So most theoretical approaches will recognize that recognizing the attitude expressed in an ironical statement is a key feature. So Grice says, for instance, irony is intimately connected with the expression of a feeling, attitude, or evaluation. I cannot say something ironically unless what I say is intended to reflect a hostile, a derogatory judgment, or a feeling such as indignation or contempt. Okay, and these can be, of course, there's a whole area of types of attitudes, but it has to be a negative attitude. Again, something that Yolanda pointed out very nicely in the thesis, and I think one thing we all more or less here agree about. Now let's get to the point where we agree less. So what I'll base this talk on is a view of irony where irony is viewed as having a triadic nature. So you have the ironical speaker, and they communicate to an addressee. But what they do communicate is they communicate a dissociative attitude from a thought that is attributed to an ironical source. That source, which can be a person or just norms or hopes or group of people. So it's a source to which the speaker attributes a thought, and they dissociate from that thought. Okay, and what they communicate to the addressee is really the dissociative attitude they have towards the ironical source, so towards that thought. Okay, and you'll see why actually in what I say later this kind of view is rather important. So please roll with me for a bit. So the attitude expressed by verbal irony is communicated in an implicit way. This is also kind of seems key to irony, and it is essentially dissociative. And that's regardless of the interactional function of the ironical statement. So it's that dissociative attitude and that negative attitude is present both in cases of criticism and ironical compliments, for instance. So ironical praise keeps exactly that same attitude, even though it has a positive element to it. And Deirdre Wilson writes, dissociative attitudes themselves vary quite widely, falling anywhere on a spectrum from amused tolerance through various shades of resignations or disappointment to contempt, disgust, outrage, and scorn. It's very fitting that it's Deirdre writing this. I mean, the British really do the whole shade. So what we have is that irony comprehension will crucially rely on the ability to recognize this dissociative attitude that the ironical speaker intends to convey, okay? And that's the dissociative attitude that they express towards the proposition expressed, so towards the content of the ironical utterance, and also towards those who might endorse this proposition expressed, so towards the source. Okay, yeah, you'll see what I care about, why I care about this. Okay, so you have some experimental elements that reinforce the idea that there might be that the dissociative attitude might be important to irony. So social information that we have about the speaker, such as them being frank or being jokesters, will play a role in understanding irony. Information inferred from social categories, so speaker occupation. If the speaker is a comedian, he will be more easily perceived as being ironical than if they are scientists. I'm always amazed by these results, but here they are. Apparently, it's so. Anyway, these all seems to be cue to the communicative intent, and that's indeed what's fine. So, social information and social cultural stereotypes aligning with the expression of dissociative attitude in a given context will facilitate irony comprehension. Okay, so that seems to fit well. Another thing that seems to facilitate irony comprehension is the presence of an antecedent, really the presence of an echo of something that was before. So that also seems to enhance irony processing and comprehension. And what happens there is that it makes the thought one dissociates from more salient, and thus, the irony. The recognition of the ironical attitude is made easier. Okay, so now let's get to the core of this, which are the socio-cognitive skills which are involved in attributing this implicit dissociative attitude. This is really what we wanted to get to. And this is where epistemic vigilance comes in the picture. So, what is epistemic vigilance? Well, it's a suite of cognitive mechanisms. These are targeted at the risk of misinformation. So that misinformation can be accidental or it can be intentional. So what we do with epistemic vigilance is we assess the reliability of the source of information, the reliability of the individual who dispenses the information, and we assess their competence, whether they know what they're talking about or not, whether they have enough elements, and also their honesty. So whether they're knowledgeable and whether they're benevolent towards us. So they might give us false information simply because they don't know, or they might be giving us false information because they lie. Okay, so. But there's also another aspect of epistemic vigilance, which is epistemic vigilance towards the content, and there we evaluate the quality, the believability of the incoming information itself, its coherence, in fact, and the epistemic vigilance towards the content of an utterance is what Yolanda mentioned yesterday as metalogical ability. So whether the content itself is coherent and actually matches knowledge we have about the world otherwise. Now, let's look at first the epistemic vigilance towards the source, and let's remember this pattern of mistake displayed by children. Irony is mistaken for first an error, then a lie before the children start recognizing the ironical intent. So in an ironical statement, the speaker expresses a position that is false, but they do not believe that it to be true, unlike what would happen if they are mistaken, and they do not intend to convince the hearer that it is true, unlike what would happen in a lie. Okay, so it seems that this epistemic vigilance towards the source should be exactly what is taken into account there. So the development of epistemic vigilance towards deception might play a role in irony comprehension. That was where we started. That's where we thought, oh, okay, we've got it. Now we know why the kids don't get it. So what it seems to happen, it seems to be the case that irony comprehension for children, and as a result for adults as well, would require to actively evaluate the competence of the speaker to rule out the possibility that they are mistaken, and the honesty of the speaker, so that they rule out the possibility that they are deceiving them. So basically, the child would have, and the adult, would have to rule out that the person doesn't know what they're talking about, so they know the proposition is false, and to rule out that they're lying, so they actually intend you to recognize the proposition is false. Now, we know that the understanding of intentional deception starts around 5. In fact, 4 to 5. So understanding of lie is another clear threshold that matches, in a sense, that of irony. And so that makes for a perfect story, right? They need epistemic vigilance to understand lies. They also need epistemic vigilance to understand irony. This is perfect. We can pack it up and go home. This is fantastic. I've just convinced you that we all need that. Yes, except we have a good friend called Olivier Mascaro who works on exactly on that, on the development of lies, and he pointed out rightly to us that our story was all fine and well, except that if we were right, what happens with children before they understand lies is that they're gullible. So if we were right before the age of 5, they should just understand, they should just assume that speakers are competent, and they should just assume especially that they're benevolent and don't lie. So before the age of 5, at the turning point, really they should understand irony, because they don't have any reason to question that the speaker is benevolent. So that was a bit of a spanner in the works when we got to that point. So the epistemic, the emergence of epistemic vigilance towards deception might explain the fact that it's mistaken with irony from the age of 5, but it doesn't tell us what happens before, and the data is very, very clear. Children do not understand irony before the age of 5. So they lack the understanding of irony before they can evaluate honesty. Okay, what about the epistemic? So we still have our problem, right, for children. What about the epistemic vigilance towards the content? So the other thing to remember is that, of course, towards the source, from the age of 5, probably the epistemic vigilance towards the source and the fact that you can rule out that the speaker doesn't know what they're talking about or that they are actually trying to mislead you will play a role. Now, what about the epistemic vigilance towards the content? Well, an ironical speaker often expresses something that's blatantly false or irrelevant to communicate their dissociative attitude. And there, the epistemic vigilance towards the content, the methodological ability, will allow you to assess the believability of the information this itself. So as Mihail pointed out earlier, detecting this contextual incongruence, recognizing the falsehood or irrelevance of the proposition literally expressed, should help understanding irony. And that's where the epistemic vigilance towards the content might kick in, okay? And we know that this is the case. But again, even though that might actually play a role, it doesn't seem that the epistemic vigilance towards the content is either sufficient or necessary for ironic understanding. It's very useful, And I think there are clear cases where this is, we use this cue, but we don't need it. So we can understand irony. Now, I'm really not talking about individuals with autism, but neurotypical adults can recognize irony in situations where the hearer has no prior belief about the context, so we don't have strong reasons to perceive an incongruency. So there's no contextual incongruency there, and yet we can still recognize irony, in particular if there are clear cues, such as intonation or things like that. We can also fail to perceive contextual incongruency, for instance, because we don't agree with the speaker. So Kepa again says that was an excellent talk, being ironical, and Joanna miraculously actually thought it was an excellent talk and really doesn't agree, and she can still perceive the ironical intent of Kepa. Okay, so this contextual incongruency is very helpful, but it's not necessary. So what we have is that what I'll call from now on the first order epistemic vigilance, which we talked about now, towards the source, allows the hearer to assess the reliability of the speaker, so that allows us to avoid misinterpreting ironical statements as mistakes, because the speaker would be incompetent, and it also allows us not to interpret ironical statements as lies, because the speaker would be dishonest. And the first order epistemic vigilance towards the content might facilitate irony understanding, as for instance the data that Mikhail showed us, by detecting the incongruency or in fact the irrelevance of the literal content of the statement against contextual assumptions that the addressee holds. Okay, so this is your first order epistemic vigilance. You have the epistemic vigilance towards the source, the epistemic vigilance towards the content, and that allows you to differentiate irony from errors and lies. We are not the only ones who have talked about this kind of epistemic vigilance. This is more and more kind of creeping in the literature that epistemic vigilance might play a role in ironical understanding. But while first order epistemic vigilance might be helpful to recognize ironical intent, and I think it actually plays a role, it's fundamentally insufficient. So we kind of, so irony understanding crucially involves the recognition of the attitude expressed by the speaker, and that attitude may but need not be shared by the addressee. And what we want to propose is that to recognize the ironical attitude, the hearer needs to exercise something else, which is second order epistemic vigilance. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay, so what is second order epistemic vigilance? Well, it's the same thing as first order epistemic vigilance, but one level up. And you can have second order epistemic vigilance will be the ability to assess the epistemic vigilance of others, and again that would be the ability to assess the epistemic vigilance of others towards the source and towards the content. And here we have Mikhail and his well-known tendency to read tabloids, right? So he reads all these I think it's not tabloids actually, but he reads a lot of these journals with poor fact-checking and things like that. Okay, so in my example, Mikhail reads a lot of tabloids, and when you talk to Mikhail, you know this. So Kepa knows that Mikhail reads all these tabloids and loves these tabloids and kind of buys their ideas. So when Mikhail comes and tells him about the latest sensational story he read in a tabloid, Kepa might actually exercise second order epistemic vigilance towards the story Mikhail tells him about. He might exercise epistemic vigilance towards the content. So he knows that Mikhail is not very good at judging the poor fact-checking of these tabloids, and so he exercised his epistemic vigilance. So basically, he he assesses the epistemic vigilance of Mikhail towards the content of the tabloid. He also assesses when Mikhail insists that no, this is really how it happened because that wonderful tabloid says so. Then Kepa actually exercises his epistemic vigilance towards Mikhail's epistemic vigilance towards the source of the information, which is the tabloid. Okay?
Kepa trust.
Always.
Always.
In order to see how that might work for irony, let's go back to the speaker. The speaker, and let's go back to the speaker's first order epistemic vigilance. The speaker has a dissociative attitude in an ironical statement, and this dissociative attitude requires the speaker to exercise epistemic vigilance towards the content or towards the source of the utterance. Okay, so by communicating this dissociative attitude, the speaker makes her epistemic vigilance manifest. Okay, so that's on the side of the speaker. So in being ironical, the speaker makes manifest that she entertains a thought attributed to a different source, the ironical thought, and she critically evaluates it. And that's a first order epistemic vigilance. And now to understand this, the hearer must exercise second order epistemic vigilance. So in understanding the ironical intent, the speaker involved in understanding, so when the hearer understands the ironical intent of the speaker, the hearer must grasp this dissociative attitude. So the hearer must be able to exercise a more advanced second order epistemic vigilance, and that's the capacity to attribute epistemic vigilance towards the source and towards the content to others, to the speaker, and evaluate it. Okay? That clear so far? Okay. So this allows the hearer to recognize that the speaker is expressing a dissociative attitude by distancing herself from a source that they judge unreliable and from a content that they take to be false or irrelevant. Okay, so what we say is that it's only by assessing whether the speaker has gone through this epistemic evaluation and taken the output of this epistemic evaluation as a reason to express a dissociative stance that the hearer will interpret correctly the speaker's utterance as ironical. So what we have here in the second order epistemic vigilance is that we have the same division as before, second order epistemic vigilance towards the source. So that will be assessing the speaker's ability to assess the reliability of an informant, okay? And then the epistemic vigilance towards the content, then the hearer assesses the speaker's ability to assess the believability of a piece of information. And what we propose is that this is what allows to grasp the dissociative attitude, ironical attitude. Okay, so to conclude, I'll just go back to why that makes irony different from other figurative uses and why it makes it appear so late in development. So irony comprehension requires the audience to attribute to the ironical speaker the intention to convey her dissociative attitudes toward the proposition at issue. So what we propose is that irony requires the child to exercise the capacity to evaluate others' capacity to be vigilant towards misinformation. So, So that's a kind of summary. We have epistemic vigilance, the suite of cognitive mechanisms that assess the quality of information and the reliability of the person who provides the information. You have the first order epistemic vigilance towards the source, towards the content, and that in the case of irony will help differentiate irony from errors and from lies. Sometimes that's very useful, or that might facilitate the understanding of irony. And then you have the second order epistemic vigilance, again towards the source and towards the content, and that we say is really that what allows you to grasp the ironical attitude. So we say inferring the dissociative attitude implicitly communicated by an ironical speaker involves exercises second order epistemic vigilance towards the source, towards the content, or towards both. And it may also involve first order epistemic vigilance towards the source and or towards the content, but that's not necessary. I think there are many cases where it does involve this first order epistemic vigilance, but it's not core to irony, whereas second order epistemic vigilance is. Now, of course, this second order epistemic vigilance will require a richer cognitive repertoire than metaphors and implicature, for one thing. Necessarily, second order epistemic vigilance requires additional levels of meta-representation. Okay, I didn't say how many levels, and I didn't say it was theory of mind, right? I said additional levels of meta-representation. And also, and I think importantly, it requires successfully integrating the outputs of several mechanisms. So that of the first and second order epistemic vigilance towards the source, towards the content, and probably a few other things actually. So that will add extra complexity and lead to comprehension and processing difficulties. And bear in mind that will lead this extra complexity and the additional levels of meta-representation should not only be a problem for children, there will be a problem, of course, also for some atypical, neurotypical populations, and also for neurotypical adults, they should make things just more heavy, more difficult, so slower, for instance. So the exercise of second order epistemic vigilance is core to irony understanding and explains, at least partially, its late emergence. Children will need to acquire the relevant cognitive repertoire, including the mastering of the meta-representational complexity and disintegration issues. And they need to do that before they can understand irony. So, what about the puzzles we thought set at the beginning about children and irony? What do children's comprehension of irony and lies correlate? I think that should be quite clear right now. If they both require epistemic vigilance, it makes perfect sense that they correlate. And to start with, the first order epistemic vigilance will be key, but even more so because of the second order epistemic vigilance. Bear in mind that they do correlate, but irony still seems to appear a bit after the understanding of lies. Typically lies between 4 and 5, we're typically good. Why is irony first mistaken for errors and then deception, and before being correctly interpreted? Well, then again, the understanding of first order epistemic vigilance is crucial, and you need to actively assess whether somebody might be mistaken or might not be benevolent for irony. I think that's key. So far so good. But what about why irony comprehension correlates with success on the second order false belief task, which I think is something that independently you were particularly interested in your thesis. Well, second order epistemic vigilance and circuit order false belief task recognition require more both of them require more levels of representation. Okay, so that's one aspect. they seem to be structurally, they require more level of representation, so both of them will be more complex. But there's another element, which is something that Yolanda also pointed out in her thesis, is that false belief tasks involve two components. There's the mind reading ability, the Tom ability, but there's also the epistemic metalogical capacity to evaluate the truth or falsity of a belief. And this epistemic component is also core to irony. So it might be also this that is that explains the correlation. Okay, so as I said, this work is really work with Diana, and so part of it is presented in a paper in Mind and Language. At the end of paper, we have this bit about irony, and this version is mostly taken from a new paper that we've written on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, publish it that way, right? My language is tough.
Huh? So that we know all about your epistemic vigilance now.
Okay, I have like two questions and one remark, and I really like it. I don't disagree with you. It's a bit disappointing. The first question is, I guess what you want, if I understand it correctly, is to show that you agree that second order perspective taking or complex perspective taking is required, it's a prerequisite, it's something like prerequisite to your complex epistemic vigilance, right? This is something, it's not, basically, if I got the grasp, one of the main messages is that it's not the whole story, just multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we could, to be honest, I never phrased it like that, but yes, I think the way we see epistemic vigilance, it would be difficult.
Okay.
The second order epistemic vigilance would probably fall flat completely without perspective taking.
So in a way, what you need is a case where you have complex perspective taking, but not no second order epistemic vigilance. You have to make sure that one doesn't boil down to the other. And it's a real question, because you talked a lot about understanding, but what about production? And what happens is that what's interesting is that kids lie regularly, but they become good at it only about the same age as irony, and that's kind of understandable, because to lie, I need to know what you know, otherwise, And going back to autism, that was the slide I skipped over in my talk, but what we showed is that not only, autistic adults really highly verbal, don't understand, struggle with irony, they can produce deception, but when they do it without taking the perspective of the deceiver. They do it in a really costly way. They would do it kind of as a kind of compensatory strategy. So again, these two kind of correlate. So my first question is there a case where someone doesn't have this complex perspective does have this complex perspective taking, but irony is not there because they don't have the epistemic vigilance? I just want to see how you distinguish between these two.
I think we have a few confounding elements. So what happens with lies? The first question is really, what do children do when they lie before they know what lies are? So I remember at a conference somebody asked Olivier Mascaro, who entirely works on that, so when do they start lying? He said, well, from the get-go, which is true. Kids from the beginning, they lie from. But the question is, how do they lie? So what do they do when they lie? And I thought when they produce lies, and I think an interesting idea that I've heard developmental psychologists kind of toy around with is it's kind of basically wishful thinking. It's like they don't lie necessarily to deceive you. Oh, I ate the cake. Well, I wish I hadn't eaten the cake, so I didn't eat the cake. So there's something very bizarre going on there, which I think might be a confound for irony and might be one of the reasons why we don't have irony. We don't have the same process in kids, although we have sometimes something slightly similar with older kids where they might produce some stereotypical ironical statement without having grasped the whole thing. And I don't know what cases we could find of.
So basically, again, I mean, now I'm playing the devil's advocate. That would be, we have a simple story. Why complicate it? The simple story, you need perspective taking. That's it.
Oh. Well, I think there's this attitude bit. I mean, there's this negative attitude bit, and that there's an evaluation there.
So
I don't think you get for free with perspective taking.
Okay, but that brings me to the second question. So I agree that what you say is that when you say that just the opposite, the point is not saying something opposite. But where I'm not that sure is when you say the main point is expressing a negative attitude. Because in a way, why bother? I mean, you just say this thought was bad. Why imposing on everyone this extra cost of epistemic vigilance and whatnot? Where
on bad days.
Just say, this was crap. So, and what people usually say, but they say it and then they go on. They say, yeah, it has also a social function of cohesion. But I think that that's the essential bit of why we use irony, is because you need contextual information. You need you need to know what's likely to be the belief held or, by the speaker. And that's the main point of it. And I think that, we all felt completely, well, at least I did, excluded from social groups because you don't understand they're being ironic, but they all do. And it's particularly true in adolescence. And so I think that the negative attitude bit comes from there, but the main bit is we share enough contextual background to engage in this complex thing.
Okay, I mean, maybe that's the core function of irony, or maybe that's why we use irony, and maybe that's its social function. I'm not against the idea. I mean, clearly there are cases where we understand irony where we don't have that, but maybe we do because we've done it quite a bit in cases where we had that. Does that have consequences on the mechanism I propose here?
Well, your story is that the negative attitude is the essential bit, right? This is what you need to account for. I'm not sure whether it's...
But I mean, okay.
Well, okay, let's put it the other way around. On your story, why people do this?
I mean, the idea is to get a mechanism that allows you to do that. Now, if you want to say initially they do that mostly for social cohesion and group belonging, for instance, okay. I mean, it could be the other way around. Irony is a tool we use in that case, rather, or it's a tool that's okay. But I don't think it impacts directly.
No, it was just a question.
Yeah.
Okay. And the final remark, when your example about the contextual incongruence with Kepa in the talk, I think that's slightly misguided because the context has to be like the shared context. And if you believe the talk is good and he believes the talk is bad, none of this is shared information, right? What's shared is that, or what you accommodate is that he believes that the talk is bad. So I don't think that this, I wasn't really convinced by just this example.
No, I mean, the main point there is you don't need that incongruence. You can have irony in cases where you don't have contextual incongruence. First of all, you can have it in cases where you don't know the context. You can still get it.
But it's like accommodating a presupposition, right? Once you think that the guy is ironic, you accommodate the fact that there is a contextual incongruence. You have to, it's a presupposition case.
Okay. So you would say, in a sense, basically in a prototypical case of irony, that first order epistemic vigilance that allows you to recognize is actually core. And in the cases where you don't find it, it's because we use mechanisms to accommodate for that.
Actually, I think that most of the cases when we use irony, we prompt an accommodation of it's like, informative presuppositions are really common in reality. So that's the same kind of phenomenon to me.
Okay.
So
now
I think irony requires, to be successful, you need this kind of stuff which you accommodate there.
Okay.
I think, but otherwise that's pretty good.
Thanks for the talk, really interesting. I have a question about the dissociative attitude of the ironic speaker. So there is a dissociative attitude because the proposition expressed is false, and you want to take distance with respect to that proposition and the source and all that. Is this a feature of all irony? I give a talk, then you start asking me questions. I reply in a very passionate way, but too passionate way. I sound a bit aggressive or something. And you say, I love passionate speakers. You do love passionate speakers, because maybe you're a passionate speaker too. That's true. And still you are ironic. I mean, I hear the irony. So you are the ironic speaker, and you don't have a dissociative attitude towards the proposition expressed, right?
Well, I think...
that doesn't make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you have these cases where basically it's also cases where you don't have a contradiction. So where I think one of the examples that Deirdre Wilson gives is in a fight with a partner, you say, I love it when you're kind to me. Well, clearly, you love it when the person is kind to you. So the dissociative attitude is not towards the proposition, but it's in this context the clash with the fact that, well, I imagine in a dispute the partner is not very kind. So that doesn't work quite the same way in your example because you don't have the same clash. But again, it's not just the proposition expressed, is the context will play a huge role there. So you still have a dissociative attitude, but it's not necessarily straightforwardly to the proposition expressed. It can be something more complex there.
For example, in my case?
Well, for example, in your case, the fact that the understanding that it's good to be passionate in some cases, but really you should pipe down in others. So something like that. Okay. So a more general expectation about behaviors in talks and things like that.
Okay, good. So the falsity of the proposition is not really essential for the dissociative attitude?
No, absolutely not. In fact, there's been quite a lot of discussion of ironical cases where the proposition is not false. Okay. So it's as it is not essential, for instance, for metaphor. You also have metaphors where the proposition is not false. She's no angel. Yeah, well, yeah. literally she is no angel.
Well, in this case, not only it's not false, but the speaker does believe that. I mean, I do believe that. I love passionate speakers.
No, and I'm sure in a dispute you do believe that your partner, when your partner says nice things to you. But it's the same for metaphor. You do believe that the person is not literally an angel, and still you can make. So that's
okay. Okay, but that's helpful. So now the dissociative attitude you're saying involves more than the more than the proposition. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think I have another question, but I think following Andreas, I do think that, the quick account does have a problem with the dissociation thing, because I would say that they use it in two different ways. Sometimes it's like a stronger notion as the speaker doesn't hold the belief she's attributing to someone else, or she doesn't believe it's true, and there are very similar cases in which this doesn't happen. So it's difficult to say that the speaker dissociates in these cases, because she believes that this thought or utterance she is attributing is true. Like you should know a lot after a speech. So in some other cases, I think they use this notion of dissociation in a lighter way, in a weaker sense, and I think that's what you were doing right now. Like, it's not that the speaker doesn't hold this belief that she's attributing to someone else, but even if she believes that that's true, that's not what she wants to communicate right now with this utterance. And that's the difference, that's the point that makes the difference, I would say so.
I don't know. I mean, I think we can put to the side the proposition expressed as defined, by the rules of semantics. But once you kind of embellish that a bit for context, as you would like in literal meaning, saying in a specific context. Let's say you're not ironical and you say, oh, I love passionate speakers. You might actually be narrowing that to not all passionate speakers, to specific context, to specific. And I think that's, in fact, that's also, in a sense, we could say that's what you do with irony, and that's what in the case Andrea, right? In the case Andrea built up, that's what I would say you do. What you have is it is a proposition, but that's not the proposition expressed such as semantic rules would give it to you. It's much more something much already pragmatically enriched and blah, 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 blah. And that's the one that I'm going to have a negative attitude towards. I don't know. That would be my interpretation of it. And I think in that case,
what you are dissociating from. If to dissociate is to take that you don't hold something, or you.
I'd say it's much more than it's not just that you don't hold it. I mean, there's that whole range of attitudes. So you not only do you not hold it, but you hold all sorts of rather, a big variety or rather complex attitudes. Stances towards it, and it's true. Truly living in the UK, you see them all the time, and you see the whole range, and you see it publicly in the media, in the journals, and all, elsewhere as well. But I have to say they do irony with particular.
It depends on the formulation, but I think that on the traditional formulations of the quick account, there are two different things. One thing is the attitude you express, and you can be either you have a huge range of attitudes, and they are usually negative, not always. That's what they hold. But the dissociation is always there. They are like two different elements. So there is something that you echo and you dissociate yourself from it, and you express a negative attitude. So the attitude is there. In Andrea's example, it's there in the you should know a lot. I don't know if the dissociation is there. It is in a weak sense, in which, I believe that you are a good speaker, but that's not what I'm intending to communicate right now with my identity.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I see how the dissociation is not there.
What are you dissociating from if you say, oh, I love it when you are kind to me? You believe that you like it when...
Yeah, but you dissociate from the idea that the person is kind to you now.
Yeah, so, but that's not part of the proposition.
Well, it might, I mean, once you do the proper work on it, it might be. Again, it's not part of the proposition, such as the semantic...
it can be an implicator or something like that, but it cannot be part of the...
You could dissociate from an implicator, why not? If the
Okay,
implicator
so yeah,
is...
dissociation in a much weaker sense than it is in the...
I don't know. I mean, a lot of what they use is, I mean, you dissociate from general expectations, you dissociate from hopes, you dissociate. So, I mean,
Yeah,
an implicator that's...
I don't hold that expectation, I don't hold that belief, I don't hold that desire. And in these cases, it's not that I don't hold it or I don't... It's saying, I believe on that, I hold that, but in this, right now, I'm not trying to communicate that. So there is a difference there, I would say. No.
I mean, I think you're right that these cases are not, I mean, they're not exactly, they're not exactly the same, and they're very interesting. I'm not sure I see, I think they still involve a dissociation, they still...
I think so, but I think that in order to see dissociation there, we must understand it in a weaker sense, and usually that's not the notion that is used in the echoic account in order to argue for the attribution. Maybe we are going to...
Okay. So what you say is that the way you see it used is really a dissociation from the proposition expressed as understood in a very classical way of what...
Not really, but the dissociation doesn't have to be done holding some... what I want to argue against, I guess, is that there must be a source to which we are dissociating from, so there is an attribution.
Well, you could easily have an attribution in that kind of case, but I'm kind to you, and then it's like, yeah, right, you're kind to me now, and the echo there would be very easy to implement.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Okay. I guess my issue is that I would agree with everything that you were arguing for. And I'm very happy with your argument of the epistemic vigilance, but I don't think any evidence or any argument there in favor of an attributive view. And actually, I think it can be perfectly well accommodated in a Galician implicature involving scheme, and especially it patterns very well because in a Galician view, ironies are in the family of lies and mistakes. And it's the echoic account that says that irony is in the family of indirect speech and echoes. So I'm very happy with what you have presented, but I guess I'm missing something because I think it's evidence in favor of an implicature-based account of irony.
Okay, that I don't agree with, but I mean, in a sense, what we propose here is really the existence of this second-order epistemic vigilance mechanism, which I think is really pushed by data and the fact that there are various phenomena. I presented here more in detail the developmental, because this is what I know the best. But in fact, what we look at when we look at neurotypical adults, when we look at neurotypical population, all of this data really comes together. I mean, they tell okay, guys, there's something about irony that's clearly more complex and clearly needs accounting for. And this is what we were trying to do here. And to be honest, after years of trying to avoid irony as much as possible, because it's just so difficult, I'm like, yeah, okay, now it makes sense to me. Now, if that is compatible with views that are not attributive views, all the better. Now, I wouldn't say that it promotes an implicature account. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, I think if you have an implicature account and there you want to pattern irony with lies for that reason, then you absolutely need to take care of metaphor and metonymy and the way it works for Grice, because that doesn't pattern. So I'm, this is not the view I would put forward, but I don't see in itself anything in what we propose that would be against another view. So the mechanism of the second order epistemic vigilance in itself is not, doesn't.
And what about, I don't know anything about experimental things, but what about the developmental order? So it's not like a good sign that irony comes after lies and mistakes, and it shouldn't be, if irony is a special sort of an echo, it shouldn't be shown in the data that the children start practicing with echoes, indirect speech, and then when they learn to be ironic after, it shouldn't pattern with that?
It should.
And
Because
what you show is that it does pattern with lies and mistakes. And that's just exactly what we are claiming.
Yeah, but it does also pattern with.
Pattern with echoes and indirect.
I mean, for as much data as we have, we are missing. Of course, we don't have everything, and again, what I talk about in lies and mistakes, it's based on a few studies. It's just that the pattern is very striking, but we don't have a ton of data. But it does pattern also with that. So these are hypotheses that are testable. Yeah. So, for instance, would irony, as it seems it does, pattern with other kind of attributive uses?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say so much. I don't know.
Well, you wouldn't. I would. So no. But as far as we can see, from what we have, yeah, it works.
I think that it's like I don't know if evidence, but it seems like a signal that children in the beginning they mistake irony just with mistakes, then with lies, and then with they realize that it's irony, because it's just what we would think it will happen. Because usually you believe that call it literal meaning or what you prefer. The speaker is sincere and literal, so the literal meaning is what happens. Then there is, when there is a mismatch between the literal meaning and the speaker's belief, you start believing that, well, there is a mistake there. Then you start believing that, it's not a mistake, it was intentional. And then you realize, but she's not trying to deceive me. So it's intentional, the mismatch, but she's trying to make me recognize it. So it patterns so well that, I don't know, maybe I want to see the evidence there, that's the case.
No, I mean, it does, and this account with epistemic vigilance, in fact, both the first and the second order can account for that. I mean, that was in fact, that was how we got there. And then we realized, well, obviously, this is not just about children at all.
Well, I have two questions. One, I think is short. We'll go for that first. In the cases of very similar irony, like they were explaining, can it be that in the epistemic vigilance you have first the evaluation of the source of the speaker, but can it be that that apart from the content, you have evaluation, for example, of the other components like the illusionary force of that utterance or the appropriateness of that utterance in a particular context or something like that, in order to go around the dissociation from the content?
But I think you could have a lot of different things. This is what we try to show for the first order epistemic vigilance. I'm not sure these are necessary. That doesn't mean that in specific examples you won't find them. In specific examples you might find them. They might actually greatly facilitating understanding irony, but they're not necessary. And also they're not sufficient.
May I just follow on these examples of very similar, the Andreas example, and I think that it's no chance that all these are always generic, and in that case you can just account for them as dissociating from a proposition, because when you say a lot of speakers who are passionate, this being generic is basically, there's a lot of quotes, etc. Basically, you're saying I love all speakers who are passionate, and you're just dissociating yourself from that. Same thing when I love when you're being kind to me. It's like all the instances, all the events that could be described as you being kind to me, this is one of these, I love them, and then I dissociate from that. So that, I don't think that...
I'm not...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that it's...
I love when you're being kind to me. I think there's so many stars for ad hoc concepts next to that kind.
Right,
but
it's so more complicated because, from the semantic point of view, because of the description of events. But this case, I don't even... I think that these are just by dissociating from a proposition in an easy way.
But you can have particular cases of that. Like, for example, imagine that you say to someone, oh, you look stunning, and this is inappropriate. It's like, and someone says like, oh, she definitely looks stunning. And you are being ironic towards what you have said because it's inappropriate in that specific context.
Right.
But it's not that general as I love when...
yeah.
And also generics, as far as I know, are not equivalent to universal statements.
No, they're not, right. They're not.
So that's one of the main points.
Right, but when you use them, you don't use them in front of an exception, right?
Okay, but that would be closer to what Yolanda was saying, as in the problem there, and probably the thing you are dissociating from has to do with the situation you're using the generic, rather than the fact that you're taking distance from the content of the generic, which is not,
yeah, well, I mean,
which doesn't involve a universal quantifier, right?
Yeah, but it's like saying, okay, you know, well, but let's, that's it.
Okay, so and I have a second question that I think that is very related with the dissociative attitude and the question I have, and I see what you told me, like, okay, maybe I was misunderstanding your paper in the dissertation, because I fail to see why it's not sufficient with the first order epistemic vigilance. I hear you and I agree, but in a sense, if you are understanding that this is not a lie and that this is not a mistake, and you somehow understand that it's irony, is that because you can grasp that this is this negative attitude, and maybe this is because I cannot take out of my mind that realist thing, and that's why I'm pushing towards it. But yeah.
So I think the first, so in your thesis, what you mentioned was really what we mentioned here as the first order epistemic vigilance, which we tried in this new paper we wrote to explicit much more. Okay, because you see it in a few other papers, but we really try to say, okay, what exactly does it mean to have this first, just what other people talk about epistemic vigilance? Well, mostly what they refer to is the contextual incongruity. Okay, that's one thing, which might be more essential than what we had in mind. Maybe, okay, it might very well be that the cases we have are kind of a derivative, or in processing terms at least. And the other case is really what you do towards the source. Really, they are knowledgeable and benevolent, which seems in many cases. Now there are cases where it seems you don't need any of that. That, you know, all of this is assumed, and you don't go there. This is why we try to say, okay, this might be used, and I think it is used, and I think I think there are cases, particularly when irony is difficult, where all of us actually say, well, does he really believe that? You know, okay, but there are also cases where we don't use it, so it's not necessary, it's not sufficient. Now, none of this gives you the attitude. The attitude has to come from somewhere else. This is why we introduce the second order epistemic vigilance. The attitude really, the first order epistemic vigilance just tells you the person is not lying and they know what they're talking about, and there's a clash with reality. So, okay, that you can get with first order epistemic vigilance, which already might explain quite a few things, for instance, for kids, but the attitude is you have to get from somewhere else. And this is where we introduce the second order epistemic vigilance as key to getting this attitude. And the beauty of this proposal is that once you do that, the complexity comes for free. Because the minute you have a second order, all of that, you have the first order epistemic vigilance, you have the second order epistemic vigilance. Obviously, this is going to be extremely heavy. Obviously, this is going to appear later in childhood without actually a very clear age threshold. You have a threshold, but it moves depending on so that's exactly what happens for lies, for instance. So when Olivier Mascaro tested for lies, they looked at various components of understanding lies, and what they found was each one of these components separately could be accessed earlier. But once you get to the lying part and put the three core components together, then you're stuck. And one of the reasons you're stuck is the heaviness of putting them together. So the second order epistemic vigilance and the heaviness it comes with is fundamentally different from pretty much any other phenomenon we have in pragmatics, and that works well with the data. Irony really does not seem to be processed. I mean, the data just doesn't match with all the other pragmatic phenomena. But I don't think you can get the attitude without so that's what this mechanism allows us to get. And by the way, explain a few data.
Well, I hope it's not very too full question. It's about the developmental story you told, and I mean, I was surprised. I mean, I find the first step missing, like the step in which the children believes everything takes us through just because their mom tells us so, or something like that. So before mistaking some irony as error or mistake, it would take us literal, true, something like that, before they have any epistemic vigilance about sources and contents, right? There would be something like gullibility. You mentioned that, I mean, total gullibility. Then the conflict between what mom says and what the teacher says. I heard a lot of parents complaining about now my word means nothing. Everything is the teacher. So and
yes. I think we all have that.
So it seems that before detecting errors or mistakes, it would be swallowing everything said to them by some people. And is that so? And then how that things kicks in first? It is first source epistemic vigilance, or is first content, or there is no data?
Okay, so.
Because this seems that the error mistake seems to be, well, first we have the vigilance about the content, so they realize that this might be false. So the speaker, I don't question the speakers.
Actually, that might. So there is. So what I talked about earlier, that this objection that Olivier made to us, it's. Basically, first order epistemic vigilance wouldn't get us out of it. So what the kids do is, I remember with one of the au pairs we had, she looked at my son once, who was covered in he was writing on a blackboard, and he just, of course, took his hand and went all the way over his trousers, his clothes, and she says, "Oh, you look great like this." And he was 3. And the older one was 6, and I said, okay, now you've just actually told him to do that again, and you've just actually made fun of him in front of his bigger brother, who understood the ironical intent and he didn't do. So don't do that. But yes, what happens with the younger kids is they take it literally. Now, there's a few caveats in that. They are not gullible. Kids are not necessarily, I mean, they are, to some degree they are, but they're not. There's a lot of evidence that they track whether people are knowledgeable or not, and some of this evidence is strikingly early. So they do. So that develops, but more gradually, and they become better at it. Where I think where we have really a big threshold is towards the benevolence. What they don't see is the lies. The fact that you might not know much, that comes much earlier. It comes much more gradually. It depends on the paradigms. So what happens in the beginning is they believe what you say. Now, if all was hinging on this first order epistemic vigilance, well, before the age of 5, they believe you, and you're knowledgeable, say, and you're benevolent. So if that's all there was to it, they should understand the irony as ironical, because they wouldn't think you're lying, and they wouldn't think you don't know what you're talking about. But that's not what they do. Earlier, they take the literal meaning on. So that's because they don't recognize the attitude. It's not enough to think that you're not lying. It's not enough to think that you have to actively assess whether you're lying or not, and whether you are knowledgeable or not, which is very different from just assuming it. So for irony, you have to actively assess it, or you have to kind of, in adults, you have to, in a sense, have pre-assessed it. Of course, when I talk to Mikhail, I believe everything he says. Okay, it comes with it. With all your love of sensational stories, of course. So yeah, when they're younger, they just take the literal meaning, and then I think in big part we don't really know whether it's. It seems to me to make sense that contextual and congruity would come first, and kind of methodological abilities might kick first to some degree, and it does seem to be the case that judging the source as not being benevolent, that's something that takes a long time. I mean, it's really, the experiments that Olivier Mascaro have are absolutely striking. You tell these kids who are 3 and 4, he's a big fat liar, and they go with what that person says. And that's the...
Some adults do that.
Yeah, but...
Hello, Nausicaa. I feel like it was a superb talk. You apologised for handing to me on the grounds that you thought I might already be familiar, but this really helped me understand your paper with Diana much better. So thank you. Did you allude at the end to another paper with Diana?
Yeah, we have one that hopefully is going to come out at some point.
Super. I look forward to reading it, assuming whatever's in it. Okay, so my question comes right at the end of your talk. So I'm persuaded, even if not everybody else is, that you're basically right. So let's take that as a given. And then there's an implication at the end, which you've sort of made explicit in this Q&A, that if what's going on is things like second order epistemic vigilance, meta-representations at some sort of high level and so on, in response to one question you described it as obviously heavy, and there's a background assumption that it's somehow cognitively more demanding, for want of a better phrase, maybe not present in autism and so on. That is certainly one hypothesis, but I think there's another hypothesis that I didn't see raised, and I want to just voice it and get your thoughts, which is that perhaps everything is possible from the beginning, so to speak, and it's not cognitively harder in any particular way. But what's different is that children aren't alert to the possibility of using all these communicative tools in those particular ways. Oh, you don't just tell the truth, you can actively tell falsehoods. Oh, I didn't know I could do that with these tools, and now I see that I can, and other people might be doing it too. Oh, I can attribute an attitude to and dissociate myself from it. I didn't realise that's something I could do with these communicative tools I have available to me. I could have done it in theory when I was 3, but I didn't realise that was even a thing in the world. And it's only through interaction with people, understanding human relations, how people interact with one another, how they play in dominance and hierarchies and friendships and all the things that humans do. By doing all of that, I learn, oh, I can use these tools in much richer ways than I originally thought.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a social aspect. I mean, everywhere we look, it seems that some of these things appear also, and to some degree depend on socialization. So kids who are heavily socialized from early on tend to have access to that earlier. For lying, it's the same. And certainly for irony, we know that in family where sarcasm is used a lot, kids will start using it earlier and understanding it also a bit earlier. Again, not very early, right? I mean, at 2, forget about it, 3 as well. And certainly my experience for irony and for lying is that my kids, and I've seen other kids as well, are explicit about it. Again, something they don't do about metaphor. There are a few phenomena where when they get it, they start playing with it all the time, and they do so explicitly. So they say, and now we're being sarcastic, and they use all sorts of cues. Yes, that, they make quotation marks, they use intonation, they play with it. That's not something they do with metaphor or metonymy, at least not once they start with one phenomenon like that. You see that there's a period where it's on their mind. So that would fit very well with what you say, and I think certainly the social aspect plays a role. Now, I wouldn't discard what I talk about, the heaviness of it. So Diana pushes a lot for this idea of the fact that the integration of these various capacities is what is heavy. That's paralleling what Olivier Mascaro says about lies, and I think that there's really a point there. I mean, the more abilities you need to put, that every one of these abilities actually is heavy. It requires inferencing, so it comes at a cost. So when you put them all together, okay, you compound the difficulty in a sense. It's just, I mean, okay, it's not very difficult to see. It would be pure working memory in a sense, part of it. Probably not just that, but certainly working memory. I think that in terms of meta-representational abilities, to me, it seems intuitive, but maybe it's not obvious, that the minute you have a recursion, the minute you get more complexity. And that complexity will also have an impact in cognitive terms. So it will be heavier, more difficult. So whether this complexity is in terms of theory of mind, second order theory of mind is, I think, more difficult and appears later, not because intrinsically the core of it is more difficult than first order, but simply because you embed it, so it's heavier.
Can I come in?
Yeah.
So the intuition you just voiced is great to make explicit. I think that's a common intuition across a lot of literatures. I'm not sure it's right. I don't see that embedding is computationally complicated. It's 2 lines of computer code.
Yeah, we're not computers.
Sure, but the point is, embedding. I don't see it in there. It's complex to describe, to write it down, but to embed one thing in another.
Well, I mean, Tom, if you use a lot of embedded clauses, your sentence becomes very quickly ununderstandable, and that's purely on the back of computation. So maybe I'm wrong, but I think I might very well be wrong.
We have one paper. I never quoted it.
How many papers do you have?
But what we've shown is that when people are sleep deprived, they're really bad at irony and comprehension. That goes in your direction. It was because it was an experiment of sleep deprivation. They collected a whole bunch of data, so people who don't sleep the whole night. And now tell me, and they didn't have any problems with metaphor, right? We didn't. We should have.
So you're missing one paper.
Yeah. But I would agree with you.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.